For centuries, sailors have considered the ocean depths the abode of monsters, of massive krakens, sirens, and other flesh-craving beasts. It was a no-man's land, represented on maps of crudely drawn topographies with the proverbial "here be dragons" to ward off foolhardy explorers. While most of these beliefs are grounded in myth, there are a few inspired by actual encounters with real-life sea creatures, mistakenly identified as monsters. For instance, Spanish explorer Christopher Columbus reportedly spotted mermaids during his venture to the New World. He stated in a journal entry that one of his admirals had, quote, "quite distinctly saw 3 mermaids," unquote. He went on to say that they were, quote, "not so beautiful as they are said to be, for their faces had some masculine traits," unquote. Lutheran missionary Hans Egde told tales of a giant serpent, one longer than the length of his ship and with a neck so elongated it seemed to reach the crow's nest. Of course, in time, we've come to realize that there are no such thing as monsters. These mermaids Columbus wrote of are believed by modern historians to have been manatees, and the sea serpent Egde spoke of was little more than a giant squid, no doubt given more mythical proportions thanks to the aggrandizing combination of fear and imagination. In reality, these beasts weren't beasts at all, but projections of our ignorance. In the world of Dishonored, the same could be said of the whales. Yes, they might seem monstrous, but so did the manatees and the squids. The Empire of Gristol believed the whales to be dangerous and violent creatures, but how much of that claim is true? In this episode, we will explore the esoteric nature behind these strange behemoths, and delve into their bizarre connection to the outsider and to the void. The whales of Dishonored are arguably the most debated facet of the game's lore. We were given little in terms of in-game texts which explain their true nature, and what we do know is found in secondary complementary texts and environmental observations. For instance, we know many in the world of Dishonored feel an indifference or even a disdain towards the whales, believing them to be malevolent and brutes. We also know of the Empire's lust for the oil their bodies produce. Most importantly, we know of the undefined connection between the whales and the outsider. Squaring the circle between the two isn't really a possibility, but at the very least, we can glean a better understanding of their relationship if we examine all available text. Dishonored's writer and director Harvey Smith spoke openly about the whales, referring to them as creatures of beauty and sadness, of magic and natural wonder, and of spirituality. Since we know all magic derives from the void, it's possible that the whales are not of this world, or at least that their earliest ancestors might not have originated on the earth. This is just speculation, but it might explain the presence of a singular inherently magical being in the world of Dishonored. While there are no direct comparisons between the outsider and the whales in-game, there are allusions to be found. As stated earlier, sailors believe the ocean to be the domain of monsters, specifically dragons. Many cultures had different names and distinctions for dragons, wyverns for example, sea serpents more generally. However, they were sometimes known by another name, Leviathans. Sound familiar? The Leviathan is a massive sea beast referenced in the Old Testament. It is described as having the traits of a monstrously proportioned whale and a massive serpent. It has been likened to other dragon-like entities from various myths throughout history, such as the world serpent of Norse mythology, Jormungandr, and the Mesopotamian goddess of the ocean, Tiamat, who is also represented as a sea serpent or dragon. Interestingly, Tiamat is considered the embodiment of primordial chaos. This chaos is a reference to the formless or void state which predated the creation of the universe in Greek cosmology. Thematic parallels to Dishonored should be obvious enough, with the Leviathan acting as a connection to the chaos, or more appropriately, the void. This could be a subtle reinforcement of the idea that the whales originated in the void. This could also just be a coincidence. Either way, the notion makes for good speculation. In Dishonored, the word Leviathan is used to refer to the whales in the report, "The Leviathan's Sorrow." The use of the word is deliberate. It's meant to channel the image of the biblical sea serpent. The author is intending to hammer home the idea that the whales are dangerous, primitive, and chaotic, like traditional depictions of dragons. It's propaganda. It's also analogous to how the outsider is disparaged by the Abbey, who preach against him and his works in all forms. It's no coincidence that both the outsider and the whales, who are affiliated with the void, are condemned by the ruling powers of Dishonored. Of course, the word Leviathan is not the only reference to the outsider. There is an explicit connection drawn between the two in the in-game book Spirit of the Deep. Described as an excerpt from a longer piece of fiction, the book states, I walked for hours along the coast, leaving Dunwall behind me until the lament of the waves drowned out all other feeling. I wept, knowing he would not come to me, my love. You rule my dreams, where I behold with senses I do not possess in waking life the dark splendor of your home in the deep. The ocean rests on your back like a sleeping child on his father's shoulders. In the sleepless nights of despair, you appear to me, not as the mighty Leviathan, but as a young man with eyes as black as the void. Spirit of the Deep seems to indicate that the Leviathan, meaning the whales, and the outsider are one and the same. I don't necessarily buy into this notion for a few reasons that we'll discuss later. Regardless of my disbelief, it is an interesting idea, one that is supported by some subtle in-game hints. For instance, the runes. According to the outsider,
1,000 years ago there was another city on this spot. The people carved the bones of whales into runes and inscribed them with my mark.
Many speculate that because runes and even bone charms were carved from whale bones, and because they bear the outsider's mark, that this is proof of the shared identity between the outsider and the whales. Admittedly, a surface-level reading of the evidence does support the theory. After all, runes were created out of the bones of whales over a millennia ago, and branding whale bones with the outsider's mark bestowed magical properties to them, which, in turn, allowed mark-bearers such as Corvo and Dowd to wield the outsider's gifts with more effectiveness. Yet, it should be noted that those were in-game utilities. Runes and bone charms actually have other effects as well. Cobbled Bits of Bone, a book written by the assassin Dowd, provides greater insight into what these artifacts can do. According to him, there are those who can craft runes and charms. The old woman across town, they call her Granny Rags. She carves and polishes the bones of whales, stringing them together and opening them to the void until they moan like fever-sick on a cold night. I've found a few of her talismans, and with each one I touched, a tiny piece of me departed and settled in with her. What does she gain? A longer life? Some other kind of power I don't understand? The making of things is beyond me. It's because of the varying effects of bone charms and runes that we're left to question the validity of the outsider whale theory. As far as I'm concerned, there's more evidence which argues against the idea than in support of it. To me, the outsider and the Leviathan are definitely not the same being. Consider that aside from the magical properties of bone charms and runes, there's nothing else which supports the theory. In fact, when you consider the nature behind the runes and charms, it only seems to rebuff the idea more. For example, while the outsider's mark may infuse runes with greater magical properties, we have to remember where the outsider's power derives from, where magic derives from, the void. Even his quote-unquote mark likely isn't his own. While we have no information on the origin of the sigil, it's safe to presume that its power doesn't originate from the shape or design of it, but from some unseen force, the same force which undoubtedly powers the outsider. Aside from those reasons, the theory also seems at odds with the origin provided by Harvey Smith, who revealed that the outsider was previously human. Additionally, the source of the theory, the book Spirit of the Deep, is in-universe fiction written by an unknown author. Our lack of knowledge on the author's identity, and the fact that the book is not even intended to be a scholastic study, also seems to lessen credibility in my eyes. But even if there is some truth to the story, the outsider appearing in the form of a whale doesn't insinuate anything more than him having the ability to shapeshift. We actually get to witness this power firsthand in the dream of Piero Joplin. The outsider appears to him, growing in scale, then transforming into a vision of death. It's this dream which inspired Piero to create the deathly mask Corvo eventually wears. If we take the outsider appearing in the form of a whale as evidence for him being a whale, then by logical extension, we would also have to accept claims of him being the Grim Reaper as well. Lastly, the whales have likely predated the outsider by many millennia. Admittedly, this last bit is just speculation, but it's possible that they might have evolved from now extinct prehistoric megafauna. We know that the whales didn't just appear out of nowhere, and even the most generous concessions to how evolution works wouldn't allow such a species to evolve drastically over such a short period of time. Simply, the evidence doesn't add up. Whatever the connection between the outsider and the whales may be, it has nothing to do with them being the same entity. Moving on, Spirit of the Deep makes mention of the titular deep, an obvious allusion to the ocean, though I actually suspect this to be a Lovecraftian reference. Similar to Nyarlathotep in The Outsider, I believe the whales are meant to channel the spirit of the unfathomable in the alien, which were themes Lovecraft drew heavily upon throughout his career. It's this fear of the unknown which fueled his approach to horror and sci-fi, just as it fuels the fears and prejudices of the people of Gristol. The fact that the whales go without explanation or understanding only seems to reinforce this theory. In addition, the whales are designed in a way which harken back to imagery consistent with Lovecraft's monster design, the mass of tentacles at the maw of the beast, for instance. And the whales being oceanic creatures is also thematically concordant, since many monsters from Lovecraft's pantheon reside in the sea. For example, Cthulhu, the most popular of his creations, slumbers in the deep. There's also a race of amphibious humanoids called Deep Ones, which, surprise surprise, dwell within the ocean depths. Simply, the Lovecraft allusions are meant to fortify the alienness of the whales, and by logical extension, the void, where these creatures might have originated. We don't have a great deal of exposure to the void, but we do know that there are whales viewable within its bleak expanse. Whether their presence is meant to act as a reflection of the world isn't explicitly stated, though I'd guess as much, since the whales seen floating in the void are marked the same way whales captured in the real world are marked. But what are these marks? Well, in order to understand that, we first have to understand the business of whaling in Gristol. The practice experienced a major boom between the years 1820 and 1825, and presumably continued to thrive by the end of the Brigmore Witches in 1837. But how and why it became custom to begin with? The answer to that question lies in the hopes and failures of a man named Edmund Roseborough. A natural philosopher, Roseborough sought to bring knowledge and progress to the Isles. However, his ideas were rejected, and he became destitute. He took refuge in the whale yards, where he one day witnessed a group of commoners using whale oil to fuel a fire. Seeing its potential as a source of energy, Roseborough invented a means of refining the oil into the volatile but practical substance we see in Dishonored. His discovery single-handedly propelled the Empire into an industrial age. With the founding of Roseborough Industries, he managed to escape from a life of obscurity and poverty, while never forgetting where it was he came from. Roseborough's continued efforts led to many technological advancements, such as the widespread use of electricity, as well as the creation of railcars. In 1820, Roseborough met Anton Sokolov and revealed to him the secrets of processing whale oil. Out of this union came a technological boom, which brought with it its own vision of progress, a vision Roseborough did not share. Weapons of war were crafted, such as the arc pylon and the walls of light. The government adopted these tools, using them to snuff out dissent and insurrection with total authority. As a result, Roseborough became racked with guilt, remorseful that his life's work was being appropriated for deathly means. Over the course of many months, he watched from on high as the city suffered from the misuse of his inventions, until 1834, when Roseborough could take no more. He locked himself away in his office and committed suicide. Even before Roseborough's discovery, whaling had been frequent throughout the Isles. However, it was the revelation that their oil could be used as a source of fuel which made the whaling business what it is today. This is meant to parallel the real-life growth in sperm whaling, which transpired between the 18th and 19th century. American, British, and French whalers hunted sperm whales in order to harvest a substance called spermaceti. Found in the head of a sperm whale, this waxy fluid was refined into spermaceti wax oil and had numerous commercial applications, such as being used for mechanical lube, lamp oil, cosmetics, soap, waterproofing leather, as well as being used for pencils and crayons. The prospect for larger financial gains inevitably led to vicious whaling traders like the Greaves Company and the Rothwild Slaughterhouse. The hunting of these creatures was beyond cruel and involved some truly heinous practices which only got more heinous over time. Prior to the mass commercialization of the whaling trade, the operation was performed by sailors and was far cruder and more slapdash. Ships would return to shore with dead whales on board, and men would cut into them, reducing their blubber to oil in massive vats along the banks of the Wrenhaven River. However, when demand went up, many business-minded individuals saw the prospect for profit. They stepped in, ensnaring the best workers with promises of larger wages and safer working conditions. Warehouses were eventually constructed in the Rudshire Financial District, the most notable among them being the Greaves Whale House, which was notorious for being incredibly organized and unabashedly ruthless. Ebenezer Greaves, the founder of the Greaves Whale House, oversaw every facet of the business himself, and it was his singular vision which allowed the company to flourish, eventually absorbing all of its rivals until it dominated the trade. Greaves was present for many of the whale hunts. He details the hunts as follows, quote, Out at sea, they secure the beast with hooks, with lines cast from the main ship and from several smaller boats. Buoys keep the whale from diving deep. Once it's caught, a larger hook is driven through the tail, which is used to hoist the creature up through the chute. They moan and bellow for some time as the men get them onto the deck, then heft them into the scaffolding overhead. The ship adjusts its prow and returns to port in Dunwall, where the crew works on the great creature, slicing off the fattiest parts while it still lives." Unquote. We never get to see the ruthlessness of the Greaves whalehouse firsthand. After the flooding of the financial district, the Greaves refinery had to be abandoned. Thus, all processing of whale oil fell to the Rothwild slaughterhouse, which became the de facto site for the refinement of oil in Dunwall. We can actually witness the horrific mistreatment of a whale while exploring the slaughterhouse. Here we see a captive whale hanging from the ceiling. It's caked in drying blood and is in obvious pain. Painted along the body of the tortured creature is a series of numbers and letters, similar to the whale seen floating in the void. The meaning behind the numbers/letters is never explicitly stated, but it's possibly a code. Or it might just be a simple way of identifying the creatures without having to refer to them by name, similar to a product ID. In the room prior, we can also find the slaughtered remains of another whale. Its ribs, a mound of raw flesh, and a limp tail are all that remains. Additionally, we can also find rooms used for processing oil, as well as the killing floor, still filled with cadavers of frozen meat. The creatures here are considerably smaller than the whales, indicating that the slaughterhouse didn't discriminate against other forms of aquatic life. If the menu found in the canteen is any indication, it's likely these creatures eventually all end up in a can, giving new perspective to the tons of potted food we consumed during our time in Dunwall. Regardless of the barbarism these whales experienced at the hands of the whalers, they did not fare much better with the supposed academics of the world. An unnamed natural philosopher spent some time studying a captured whale while voyaging north to Tivia. His research states, quote, "By candlelight I took her apart, sketching and taking notes. Against her bellowing I cut into the mass of tentacles around her mouth. Within, I found row upon row of teeth and a baleen running along the upper jaw. Through this broom-like structure, I assumed she filled the food from the water that was too small to be chewed." Unquote. Opportunities for whale vivisections were coveted after by many natural philosophers. They sought to learn more about these creatures, about possible applications for their oil. The most noteworthy of researchers was the head of the Academy of Natural Philosophy himself, Anton Sokolov. He would frequent the Rothwild slaughterhouse and conduct vivisections on whales there, since the Rothwild extraction process involved keeping whales alive for days at a time. Sokolov's notes actually explained the purpose of the large wires attached to the captive whale. While he referred to them as stimulators in his notes, they were actually electrodes, used to shock her with high-voltage currents. Some natural philosophers uncovered surprising applications for whale oil, uses that went beyond simple energy and fuel purposes. One such philosopher, a man named William Trimble, discovered that proper infusion of whale oil combined with controlled electrical impulses could result with prolonging a human's life to unnatural degrees, albeit at the expense of basic living and motor functions, as seen through his charge, Mortimer Hatt, who at the time of the Brigmore Witches was wholly incapacitated and reduced to eating and shitting through a tube. As we've seen, the intelligentsia had relegated the whales to something meant to be cut open and studied. They were not viewed as creatures worthy of empathy, but as something that could be taken from, ravaged, and raped. Still, there were those who sympathized with them, educated men and women who argued against their ill treatment. In the previously mentioned book, The Leviathans of Sorrow, the author detailed a treatise written by an individual named Pacody, who called for more ethical treatment of whales. This Pacody character provided them with alternative means of extracting oil, stating that in lieu of hunting, the whales could be kept in captivity, where they would copulate and be husbanded. In addition, Pacody argued that hunting results with a sense of disillusion, lamenting on the destruction of social bonds between herd members. He is also noted to use terms such as, quote, aesthetic wonder, and, quote, gentle nature, in an attempt to argue for their continued harmony in their natural habitat. Pagody's progressive stance towards the whales was not shared by many. The fact that there are no other examples of such a mindset found in-game, whether it be textual or spoken dialogue via an NPC, proves as much. He was of a very small demographic. Still, there is hope for these creatures yet. While the mass majority seem to be at odds with the whales, we do have documentation of one other, a man who had bore witness to the enigmatic nature of these creatures, and what he saw challenged his beliefs. Sadly for him, and for the whales, he would not live to tell the tale. A book entitled The Deep Watchers details the final hours of a natural philosopher named Douglas Church, who suffocated in a diving bell at sea. Church had sought to peer into the dark depths, for reasons not entirely clear to him. When the day of his expedition came, he took to his submersible and began his descent, with visions of wealth, glory, or the simple allure of the unknown to fuel his mania. Tragically, Church's fate was sealed when the cable tethering the bell to his ship snapped. It tumbled into the lightless depths, groaning and shuddering from the increasing pressure, until it eventually collided with the bottom. There, under the sparse glow of a bioluminescent seabed, he could see them. The whales, or as he called them, the Leviathans. In his words, quote, "Here in their domain, they move with grace and elegance, with purpose. They have approached the sphere repeatedly now, one almost touching the portal with her great eye. As I stare into the orb, it is clear to me that the thing is not mindlessly searching for prey. It is observing me. It is curious. One by one they approach and peer into my window. There is an unnerving sense of intelligence in that gaze, devoid of malevolence. For a time, they examine me, my predicament, and allow themselves to drift off to trace the broken cables along the seafloor. I dream that one will take the cables in its great jaws and haul me back to the surface. But it is only a rapturous fantasy of a thinning atmosphere. I find myself gasping now, while the creatures move away and watch from a distance. Their song is different here. I've heard it for years on the surface, but here, it is soulful and moving. The natural philosopher in me is beginning to suspect that the song has notes we can't even detect. But here in the depths, they can be felt. I believe they are trying to come for me while I die." Unquote. If there's one thing time has proven, is that there are no such thing as monsters. From the shadowy caverns of the untamed wild to the shadowy maw underneath our beds, the only monsters we'll ever find is in the claustrophobe of our ignorance. Yes, the carnivores of nature might jaw you as soon as look at you, but they won't lure you away to a watery grave with enchanting voices, or spit fire from their mouths. They won't because they can't, and they can't because they aren't. The people of Dishonored have yet to come to this realization. True, the whales might possibly hail from another world, but they aren't bestial. If anything, they are quite sensitive, certainly more attuned to life in the beyond than we are. With Dishonored 2 looming on the horizon, I'm confident that we'll learn more about these somber giants. Whether it will challenge the assertions made in this video is yet to be seen, but something tells me that whatever we learn, it won't paint the whales in a more monstrous light. Either way, there is still one last component to the forbidden Trinity of Gristol. The void beckons, but that's a story for another episode.